When we think about the Old Testament, Genesis is probably one of the most familiar books of the Old Testament, probably the one that we think we know the best. But I'm not sure we think often, while we think of the stories, about the actual message of the book of Genesis. What I'd like to think about in this short video is just what the book of Genesis is trying to communicate to Israel and, of course, to us. All of this is part of the bigger story, which we'll be calling the meta-narrative, but it is the unified message of all of Scripture, really what God is doing. The sole transcendent creator and king is redeeming his damaged creation, led by his images. He's consuming sin and death, and he will build his perfected heavens and earth for blessing to the praise of his glory. Even though mankind has led the rebellion against God, God in grace is going to bring about his good blessing to all who will bow before him.
So Genesis is a book of beginnings. It gives us hope for blessing in a world that God has cursed. That's going to be the way that God is going to present his working, that because of sin there's a necessity of curse, and because of his grace he will bring about hope and the opportunity for blessing. And the book of Genesis is going to show Israel their significance in that.
So as we come to the book of Genesis, we need to think through God's message for the nation of Israel. I have suggested a couple of things, but we need to think through our assumptions. Who is God writing to when? If it is Israel, what's happening in their lives and what do they need? I'm assuming that this is Israel coming out of Egypt, which of course is the narrative, although not everyone accepts that. That means that these books, the Pentateuch and Genesis in particular, are primarily addressing Israel's needs, not ours. In other words, when he writes the creation account, this is important for them at that time. Certainly it'll be important for us, but the issues that he's trying to address are not primarily initially ours. They fit their cultural theological background, not ours. So he's communicating in their time period several thousand years ago, not in our time period. So what were Israel's issues? What is it that Israel needs to hear? I think there's several things that we need to think about. We need to think about God. What does Israel recognize in Egypt? Well, they are, according to the scriptures at least, worshiping the gods of Egypt, who are very different than the way Yahweh presents himself. We know that not only from Exodus, but we know that from the book of Joshua and Ezekiel and other places. So they need to understand who God really is, and to that end, Genesis is crucial. They need to understand what worship means. They need to understand how this world functions, because their worldview in Egypt is very different. Worship for them is much different. The function of the world is appeasing the gods. It's much different. What is their purpose in life? What is it that they are supposed to be doing as a nation and as individuals? And how should they respond to God? And of course, what hope exists for a future? All of these things are addressed. Beginning in Genesis 1, all of these things are initially and necessarily in Israel's context. Now, certainly these things are really important for us too, and all of this is going to impact our own worldview as well. So the book of Genesis, I'm going to suggest that the book of Genesis is intended to provide the nation of Israel with their purpose as a nation. What are they supposed to do? Well, they are chosen by God to bring blessing to all the families of the world. And how does that happen? As they show the world who God is. The source of blessing is Yahweh, not the gods that they're all worshiping. So this is going to be crucial as we understand the book of Genesis.
The book of Genesis can be easily divided into two main sections. Often we call the first 11 chapters the primeval narratives, beginning actually at the end of chapter 11 and 11:27, as you can see on the chart. The patriarchal narratives are going to change the focus of the book. In the first half of the book, speaking at least pedagogically, in the first 11 chapters of the book, we see man really cultivating sin. We see the decline of man, we see the judgment on man because of sin, and God has to bring about their downfall. The wages of sin is death. But in the second half of the book, beginning in chapter 12, we see God working initially through Abram and through his children, through his descendants, to bring about blessing to all the families of the earth. The book, of course, begins with creation. In creation, we see that God makes it good. So what happened to creation? Well, certainly it is sin, and we will see that. As we look at the book of Genesis, we see that these two main sections are broadly different. So as we look at the two broad divisions, we realize that with those two books you have, or two parts of the book, you have very different pace of narrative. In the first section, in verse 11 chapters of Genesis, we have a long pace, long time periods with very little description. So the first 11 chapters deal with all of mankind for thousands of years from creation up to the time of Abraham. In the second half of the book, in the second section of the book, in the patriarchal narratives, we see a very much more rapid pace where we have dealing with only three really generations of the family, from Abram to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. So moving from the human race to the individuals, moving from long time periods, thousands of years, to just a couple of hundred years, and moving from long genealogies in the first half to short, immediate succession from one family member to the next. Dramatic changes, but the reason for that is because God is now showing how he's going to work, particularly then for the life of Abraham and for his descendants, the nation of Israel. What he uses in order to accomplish this are 12 small sections, which we see divided up by a Hebrew phrase, toledot. Toledot is not something you have to remember, but it is significant because it is the way the author, Moses, chose to show us his structure. And in showing us his structure, he is showing us what has happened from one section to the next. Toledot is a Hebrew word or phrase which simply means this is what happened to, this is what is produced, this is what became of something. As Moses is writing this, he is then telling us what happened to the next section. So, for example, if you look at your chart that I'm putting up here on the screen, in the first initial section, as God introduces the book of Genesis, we see God making it all good. And of course, you know that. He spoke and it happened, and he evaluated it and it was good. And 7 times in the first chapter, God repeats that it was good, it was good, it was good. And the last time, it was very good. What happened to God's good creation? Well, in chapter 2, verse 4, we begin to see that as we have that first Toledot section. And we could simply say, this is what happened to God's heavens and earth. This is what happened to God's creation. He made it good, but, and what's the big but here? Man sinned. Unfortunately, the reason that we don't see God's creation in quite the same way as he made it is because of the sin of mankind. Now, if the sin of mankind results in death, which is what God announced in chapter 2 when he gave the description, and what happened then as God kicks them out of the garden, is that man is going to die. What is then going to happen to Adam? Well, obviously he doesn't die immediately, and he does have descendants, but he does die. So beginning in chapter 5, we do see that the wages of sin is death, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. But we also see that God provides grace. So there's grace both with Enoch, who walks with God and was not because God took him, and with Noah, who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so God delivers both of them from the immediate consequences, for Enoch death and for Noah death in the flood. But Noah really did not have a heart change. He had a relationship with God, but mankind hasn't changed dramatically, and so sin is still available. So beginning in chapter 6, verse 9, if Noah found grace, and yet Noah is still a sinner, what happened to Noah? Well, what happened to Noah is really the story of Noah's children, and what we see is the family is still corrupt and God is still having to bring judgment. The judgment of the flood brings about judgment on all of mankind outside of the family of Noah. But then when we get off the ark, beginning in chapter 10, we see that Noah's kids continue to spread, and there is still a downward progression of sin away from God. So what we see then with the book of Genesis is a orderly progression, an orderly accounting of what happened from a good creation because of sin through mankind until we reach the turning point in chapter 12, where God is going to work with an individual, Abram, and through him to bring about a nation, Israel, in order to accomplish his purpose to bring blessing to all the families of the earth.
So how does Genesis fit into the entirety of Scripture? Well, if the unified message, the meta-narrative, is talking about the sole transcendent creator and king who's redeeming this damaged creation and so on, we see Genesis as presenting that initial sole, sovereign, transcendent creator who is good. And he is the one who has chosen the descendants of Abraham to bring blessing out of cursing through true worship to a world continually turning away from him in rebellion. We see who God is. We see his purpose in creation and in humanity and in Israel. And we see how then Israel, and of course we must approach him. We must see him as absolute, and we must see him as good. So Genesis is going to give us the initial foundation for the meta-narrative of Scripture that God is going to give to us throughout the rest of the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament.